Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing how important it is that we stop British taxpayers' money being used to fund terrorism in the Palestinian Authority and pay the salaries of prisoners convicted for murder in Israeli prisons. Warm welcome to the programme, and my guest today is all the way from North London. His name is Jonathan Turner, and he is the Chief Executive of UK Lawyers for Israel. Jonathan, warm welcome to the Middle East Report.
Well, thank you, Simon, for inviting me onto this programme and giving me the opportunity to talk about this very important subject.
Absolutely. Before we do that, Jonathan, can you share something about your Jewish background, growing up as a British Jew here, and how you got involved in law?
Yes, well, I grew up near Birmingham, in the countryside outside there, where there wasn't much of a Jewish community, although my parents had a Jewish household. That's to say, my father was rather critical of religion, and I went to synagogue and had a bar mitzvah and all the other things. And I grew increasingly interested in religion when I went to university. I was at Cambridge, where I studied law. Law being regarded as some kind of good profession for a Jewish boy. I went into practice. I qualified as a barrister, and I specialised in intellectual property law, that's patents and trademarks and designs and so on. But I became increasingly concerned about the anti-Israel propaganda that was being broadcast and disseminated through a whole variety of outlets, including national broadcasters such as the BBC. I started looking at the possibilities of whether there was any legal redress for what was going on. I also came across the fact that enemies of Israel have been very successful in using the law or misusing the law to further their objectives, and that we've been rather slow, those of us who support Israel, in actually operating on this increasingly important field. Following a conference in Israel, we formed an organisation. It was myself and several others, a small group of people originally, set up UK Lawyers for Israel as a voluntary association of lawyers who wanted to use their legal skills to ensure that this area was used to combat some of the efforts of enemies of Israel to undermine Israel and to attack its supporters and its people and its organisations and its businesses and so on. We started with a couple of dozen people, and now we have an extensive mailing list of people who are members or supporters, and we've done a large range of projects in support of Israel and against its enemies. One of the first projects which really got us off the ground in a way was when we secured the arrest in Greece of a whole flotilla of ships that was about to sail to Gaza to violate the restrictions that Israel attempts to place on the transfer of munitions and money into Gaza to buy war materials to engage in terrorist operations. Now, the year before, 2010, the Mavi Marmara and other ships have been stopped by the Israeli Navy, but the Israeli soldiers were attacked with iron bars, with knives, with guns, and the resistance was, or the attacks on them were only overcome at the expense of several lives, and needed to say large numbers of international inquiries followed, and lots of investigations, and eventually, anyway, all this was still going on when they organised an even bigger flotilla in 2011, and this time we managed to get it arrested in port in Greece on various legal grounds, without it needing to be intercepted on the high seas by the Israeli forces.
Fabulous. And there is a particular term for this, isn't there, that what Israel faces, and that's called lawfare, where law is used as a weapon against Israel and against the Jewish state, particularly in military affairs. Is this something that you're very much involved in fighting against and giving Israel that legal protection?
That's right. I mean, in a sense, we are using some of those methods ourselves, only we're using them in support of a just and right cause, whereas our opponents are using them to create destruction and to support murder, and to prevent the possibilities of peace in Jerusalem and the Holy Land.
Excellent. So let's have a look now at the work of UK Lawyers for Israel.
For me, and for many people around the world, Israel is very close to our hearts. So the scale of anti-Israel activity in the UK can feel very personal. But the good news is the fight back is underway.
In just one area, we've used the law to stop BDS resolutions being implemented at a dozen UK universities, and also at an important professional association, the Royal Institute of British Architects.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg, and it proves the power of using the law to protect Israel.
If the people who have knowledge and drive don't speak up at the relevant time, then the falsehoods and the lies which are propagated by anti-Israel activists will become seen by the majority as the truth.
It's very simple for universities to start closing down on Jewish and Israeli societies. If we don't stand up, it will be too late.
The reality is that much of this anti-Israel activity is either illegal or based on a misuse of the law. That's where UK Lawyers for Israel comes in, because we can use the law to counter this sort of activity.
UKLFI is the only organisation to which lawyers contribute their time and legal expertise voluntarily. We work from our homes and we manage our time and our resources cost efficiently.
The approach that is taken to handling our cases is unique. We fight everything that has to be fought, whether it's in correspondence, whether we're looking at statutes and acts to look at a different way of challenging. And if we have to, we will represent somebody in court to stop them being bullied. So, for example, after question time, when George Galloway threatened to sue 12 people, we stepped in, we fought back, and his threats evaporated.
We obtained the arrest in Greece of a flotilla of ships that was intended to sail to Gaza in defiance of Israel's necessary and legitimate blockade, which prevents a flood of weapons going to Hamas. Our action prevented a repetition of the events on the Mavi Marmara.
UKLFI has complemented the communal bodies working to defend Israel's reputation by bringing to bear a highly specialised, unique and very effective legal angle to the issues we have to confront.
Another successful case is when we persuaded the police to withdraw the threat of prosecution of a blogger who exposed the lies and incitement at BDS rallies.
Do that again, I'm going to knock it out of your hands, mate.
The last thing I wanted was my good name smeared and the possibility of a criminal record and even going to prison. It was a great relief. UKLFI stood beside me all the way until I was able to clear my name.
UK Lawyers for Israel have done a phenomenal job in making it more difficult for Israel's enemies to achieve the successes they'd like to achieve.
There are a small number of us at the moment who are having magnificent successes. with growth, we can have many more successes.
The threats against Israel are increasing in number and sophistication, and for that reason we have to change our approach from a reactive one to being proactive and preemptive.
And for that we need a robust operational infrastructure.
With your funding, we can expand our team, we can get more training for people to ensure that lawyers are out there being trained to fight so that UKLFI will be the first port of call.
So please help us by funding this vital effort. And if you're a lawyer, come and join our incredible team.
As you can see, extremely impressive work. Jonathan, I was very impressed with that video, the professionalism of it all. How is your community, the Jewish community, responding to the excellent work that you're doing at UK Lawyers for Israel?
Well, not that many people know about it, I think it's fair to say. We're not very good at publicity. We're lawyers, and sometimes things are difficult to explain. And also, a legal project is very often undermined if you have publicity before you complete it. So it's quite difficult for us. We don't go out of our way to get publicity whilst things are going on, and then when we have achieved something, it's quite often a bit too late to call in the media. It's not as widely known as we would like it to be. As it happens, some of our opponents or media organisations which are anti-Israel seem to cover us rather more effectively than the pro-Israel or Jewish media. So, for example, Electronic Intifada and Middle East Monitor have done some articles about our work, which explains rather more about what we're doing than the Jewish press. But amongst our supporters and those who are familiar with work, we have fantastic feedback. And it is quite extraordinary. There's some of this on our website, actually, but we repeatedly, every week, we get comments from people who have heard about our activity saying how excellent this is, which is, of course, very good for our morale.
Excellent. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the programme, and more than happy to endorse the excellent work that you're doing, Jonathan. But we're here today to discuss the fact that the British government gives £67 million of our taxpayers' money to the Palestinian Authority each year, despite 20 years of corruption, financing terrorism, incitement to terrorism and glorification for terrorism. Why are we funding the Palestinian Authority?
Well, the British government's view is that if people stop funding the Palestinian Authority, then it will collapse and the situation will be worse. But they don't seem to appreciate that you've got to be tough with these people, and you've got to say no money if you carry on funding terrorism. In fact, the British government received a report about the effectiveness of British aid from the Overseas Development Institute, a very well-respected organisation with which they usually work closely. This organisation observed that on the one occasion that the World Bank, through which the British government was transmitting its money, on the one occasion when the World Bank said, no, we're not going to supply the next tranche of money because you've not complied with the conditions, that resulted in a very rapid response from the Palestinian Authority to address the particular concerns that have been raised. But unfortunately, the concerns about terrorism are not raised, partly because of the problem that we're going to talk about in this programme, which is that the auditors of this funding are giving it a clean bill of health. They are saying that they're not identifying, at any rate, if what British ministers say is anything to go by, the auditors are not pointing out that the funding has been transmitted to terrorist organisations or to terrorists in prison. So British government ministers who don't want to create difficulties are hiding behind the fact that the funds are audited, and they say whenever this is pointed out, oh well, British government funds are only going towards proper Palestinian civil servants and not going towards the payment of terrorists.
So let's have a look now in this story in context about how much aid money through Western nations has been given to the Palestinian Authority ever since its creation with the Oslo Accords in 1993.
In the last 20 years, over $30 billion has been invested in the emerging Palestinian state by a variety of nations, including Canada. Yet, despite of this unprecedented financial investment, little infrastructure has been built in Palestine. We met with Caleb Myers of the Jerusalem Institute to try and understand what has happened with all the money invested in Palestine.
The Jerusalem Institute of Justice is an organization that I founded here in Israel about 11 years ago in order to advance freedom of religion, social justice, civil rights within Israel and also the surrounding region. We've challenged the Israeli government on over 660 cases of civil rights issues over the last 11 years. But we speak into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and call on the international community to recognize the human rights abuses that are taking place towards Palestinians by the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and the Arab nations surrounding Israel. The international community made a terrible mistake in 1994. In an effort to push for two states for two peoples, they recognized Yasser Arafat as the legitimate leader of the Palestinian people and helped him create an entity called the Palestinian Authority, to which they gave responsibility for the Palestinians living in many places throughout the West Bank, as well as Gaza. So he immediately disregarded their human rights. One of the first things he did was that he forcefully expropriated all the media. So he got rid of freedom of expression in the Palestinian Authority. There was much more freedom of expression before he came to power. He arrested journalists. He arrested, tortured some, executed others. He executed around 30 Palestinian journalists after coming to power in 1994. Anyone who was not willing to print PLO propaganda was severely punished. So he made a very clear statement: I will be controlling all the media that comes in and out of the Palestinian Authority. We still see this today. The other thing that he did is he came to the international community and he said, I need your money. I need your money to build a proper state. He first did this in the nonprofit sector. So before Arafat came to power, around 50% of the education in the West Bank and Gaza, 60% of the medical care, 100% of the handicap care, these all came through private NGOs supported by the international community, mostly states around the Middle East and Western societies. Arafat came to these funders and said, stop giving money to these private NGOs. Start giving money to the Palestinian Authority. I want to build hospitals. I want to build clinics. I want to build education facilities. So within the first 2 years of Arafat coming into power, over 60 medical clinics were shut down throughout the West Bank. They're simply closed. You may hear once in a while a tragic story of somebody being, coming in from the West Bank into Israel to be treated at an Israeli hospital and getting stuck at a checkpoint, and something terrible, God forbid, happens. But nobody stops to ask the question, why isn't there proper medical care within the West Bank? Because Arafat shut that down, and what he never did was he never replaced them. So he never built proper new hospitals, new clinics, new education facilities. The money simply disappeared, and none of this was ever built.
With so much investment and very little oversight, the question on everyone's mind is, where did all the money disappear to?
The international community, from 1994 with the Oslo Accords until 2015, so we're looking at the last 21 years, has given more than $31 billion US dollars to the Palestinian Authority as humanitarian aid. So this people has received more money in donations for humanitarian needs than any other people ever on the face of the earth. I did a very simple calculation and compared it to the amount of money given from the United States to Europe under the Marshall Plan for the complete reconstruction of the European economy. So taking historic inflation rates into account, the amount of money given from the international community to the Palestinian Authority over the last 21 years, is more than 15 times the amount of money given from the United States to Europe under the Marshall Plan. In simple terms, this means with all the money that we gave the Palestinians over the last 21 years, we could have reconstructed Europe's economy 21 times. But what's happened with the money? The average Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza is living in abject poverty. And so this money has not been used properly. It's actually been stolen. It's been stolen in broad daylight by the Palestinian Authority. Yasser Arafat's own accountants, after he passed away, declared over $2.4 billion of cash sitting in his Swiss bank accounts. Where did this money come from? Well, everyone knows that he's siphoning off money into his private bank accounts. He was. And his predecessor, Mahmoud Abbas, is doing the same thing. He's now worth almost $1 billion. Khaled Mashal, head of Hamas, is worth over $2 billion. Drive through Jericho, you'll find more than 30 signs sitting in empty fields that say something like this: "We want to thank the good people of the United States of America, of Germany, Japan, and the Palestinian Building and Housing Department for this project, which will cost $70 million to build an industrial park, to build a hospital or a nursing home. Estimated start of project 2009, estimated end of project 2012. Empty field." So someone had an interesting ceremony. They put up a sign, they cut a ribbon, money disappeared. So we know what the money didn't do. Where did it go? Like I said, it first of all went into the private bank accounts of many of the Palestinian leaders. Second of all, it's used, for instance, to pay Palestinians sitting in Israeli prisons for carrying violent crimes against Israelis. So if you're a Palestinian that's carried out a relatively minor crime and you're sitting in an Israeli prison for up to 3 years, you and your family receive $400 a month from the Palestinian Authority. And then they have this kind of sliding scale that if you carried out a more heinous crime like murder or attempted murder, you and your family receive $3,400 a month from the Palestinian Authority. That's around $40,000 a year, which isn't a bad salary for single income in many Western nations. This is money that's purely being used for incitement to violence, and it's coming from the international aid. There's no question. So that's about $70 to $100 million a year that's being paid to prisoners just for trying to kill Israelis. Instead of helping to advance Palestinian human rights, we're actually strengthening radicals that are first abusing their own people and then becoming a danger to Israel. I'm not saying stop funding the Palestinians. What I am saying is start monitoring the funds that are going into the Palestinian Authority to make sure that they're actually being leveraged to advance human rights rather than being used to advance violence and racism and hatred and terrorism.
The international community needs to stop turning a blind eye to the hijacking of Palestinian society's future by the current Palestinian regime. Accountability must be demanded and given before another $30 billion disappears. For the Rebel Media, I'm Miguel Hecht.
An extremely good but also very troubling report there about international aid being given to the Palestinian Authority. Now, we've known for decades now, haven't we, Jonathan, the fact that British aid money, American aid money, European aid money has been used by the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat and now Mahmoud Abbas, to incite terrorism, to glorify terrorism, but also paying Palestinian prisoners. Why has it taken so long for this government to act? I know they have acted, but why has it taken so long to act to stop this terrorism?
Well, for years they've pretended that there wasn't a problem, that the payments that were being made were poverty relief payments to the families of terrorists simply because they were without a breadwinner and so on, and the same applied to anyone else without a breadwinner. But this was all completely exposed by a very good organisation, Palestinian Media Watch, which showed that this was all completely untrue, and that either British and other government ministers were misled by the Palestinian Authority, or that they misled themselves. But one way or another, what they were saying was just not correct. Then, having broken down that point, they then said, well, okay, if this is happening, it's not coming from British or American or whatever aid. It's coming from other money that the Palestinian Authority collects, and we can't deal with that. We can only deal with what happens to the money that we give. Now, firstly, that's wrong anyway, because they can perfectly well say to the Palestinian Authority, well, as long as you keep paying these salaries to terrorists and encouraging terrorism by glorifying it, and also, incidentally, paying salaries even after the terrorists are released. They get a big lump sum, and they also get their jobs are kept open for them, and if they don't want to do their jobs anymore, they get paid a salary all the same. So it's even worse than Kalev was describing. So governments could perfectly well say to the Palestinian Authority, as long as this goes on, we're not going to give you any money. And indeed, they have now moved to do that with the Taylor Force Act in the United States. Has established says that to the extent that the Palestinian Authority is paying money to terrorists, that will be deducted from any grant aid that America gives. It's been said by British government ministers, well, if we do that, then they'll just they will carry on paying the terrorists and they'll collapse and there'll be chaos. But they really need to be tougher, and this is really bluffing, because Abbas and his friends are not going to sign their death warrants by letting other factions like Hamas take over their remaining territory in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. They know perfectly well that they and all their people will be killed, as they were in Gaza when Hamas took control in Gaza. So British government and others need to be much more robust. That's one point. But the second point, an important point, is that they're quite wrong to say that it's not our money that's being used to pay for the terrorism. Firstly, because money is all the same, and payment of some money into one account relieves the need for payments into another account. So by paying the expenditure of some expenditure, that frees up money to pay other expenditure, such as the payments to the terrorists. But in any case, we found that there was clear evidence that the actual account into which the British government was paying money was the same account from which the money was being paid to fund the terrorist salaries. And when we raised this point, the British government said, oh, but it's all been carefully audited by international auditors to check that we know exactly where the money is going. So that led us to question, well, what were these auditors doing? We tried to find out, and eventually we found out. The government refuses to answer questions, or when it gets questions, it gives the minimum amount of information possible. If you ask it who are the auditors, most of the time they don't provide the names, but eventually the mask slipped a bit, and we found out that PricewaterhouseCoopers, the big and respected international firm, was in fact auditing the main account through which British aid was being transferred to the Palestinian Authority. And we questioned it with PricewaterhouseCoopers. They refused to supply us with information. And so we made a submission to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an international organisation of the more developed countries that seeks to establish common standards, particularly in the economic and business and commercial spheres. And they have guidelines for multinational companies which require multinational companies to operate in accordance with good ethics and to have regard to the human rights impacts of their activities, and to do everything, to take all practicable steps to mitigate adverse impacts on human rights that arise out of their activities. So we said, well, because their audits are being used to justify the continuation of these payments, the adverse impacts of the audits that apparently don't highlight the payments of these monies to terrorists, arising out of that is the continuation of these payments and the continued promotion and glorification of terrorism, and the continuation of a situation in which it pays to be a Palestinian terrorist. So we made our submission to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. It operates through government departments in the different members, and you are supposed to choose the most relevant one. Well, in the case of PricewaterhouseCoopers, we considered that the most relevant one was and is the United Kingdom, because the PricewaterhouseCoopers company that coordinates the issues of ethical policies and standards and risk for the network of PricewaterhouseCoopers operations, is a company that is based in London and incorporated under English law. So we complained to what's called the National Contact Point for the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development in the UK, and they considered our complaint, I assume, very carefully, because it took them some 17 or 18 months to reach a decision. But they have now reached a decision on the first aspect of the process. They have to consider in the first instance whether there is an arguable issue of non-compliance with the OECD guidelines, and that they have now done, and they've accepted the complaint. And I should say this is a very real test, because quite a large proportion, I think it's more than half of complaints, are not accepted for further consideration. So they have now accepted the complaint for further consideration, and will now seek to, they offer mediation to try and achieve an agreed outcome, and we hope to engage with PricewaterhouseCoopers to ensure that the situation is remedied. But if we can't reach agreement, then we can and will press for a determination by the National Contact Point as to whether PwC has properly complied with these guidelines.
Excellent. One thing I read in your press release you sent out, which was extremely interesting as well, we're doing a programme today on it, Jonathan, is that, according to my notes here, that PricewaterhouseCoopers stated that they did not require to pay attention to terrorist funding because it had not been agreed by the Palestinian Authority. Isn't that an absolutely ridiculous notion that they were saying that the Palestinian Authority did not ask them to look into this, so therefore they didn't, when surely as auditors they are responsible for looking and investigating where British aid money is going, which essentially are taxes, being used to pay Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons for murder and hideous crimes against Israelis.
Well, yes, it is ridiculous, and obviously the Palestinian Authority are not going to tell them, put this in your report. We are paying large sums of money to terrorists, including out of the account which you are auditing. Now, they say, however, that their audit had a narrow scope, and you'll see that in the preliminary decision that the National Contact Point has issued. That's PwC's argument, but the OECD guidelines say that the obligations of multinational companies are broader than their contractual responsibilities. So if you're buying clothes from a supplier of clothes, you may not have a contractual responsibility to see that the employees making those clothes are safe, but you have an ethical obligation arising out of your work. And similarly, we say that even if their contractual obligation, or the scope of their audit as contractually agreed, was a narrow one. Still, they had a broader obligation under these guidelines to ensure that, or do their best to ensure, that arising out of their audit, that didn't give rise to violations of human rights in the form of murder of Israelis, the deprivation of Palestinians of the money that should be going towards better healthcare, better education, and the building up of a proper Palestinian economy, and of course the defrauding of British taxpayers and other taxpayers. But there's another really concerning thing about this, which is that PwC are saying the scope of our audit was very narrow and we weren't required to report on where the money was going. But British ministers are saying, when asked about this, we have these accounts properly audited by international auditors so that we know exactly where the money is going. Now, someone is not being accurate, and we want to get to the bottom of this. Why is it PwC that's not being accurate, or is it British government ministers that are not being accurate? And if British government ministers are not being accurate, how come these mistakes are being made? Who is responsible for giving out this inaccurate information?
Absolutely. So let's remind ourselves of how the Palestinian Authority is paying the salaries of Palestinian prisoners convicted of murder in Israeli prisons with our taxes.
What would you say if you found out your tax dollars were indirectly going to pay Palestinian terrorists to murder Israeli Jews and others? That's just what's happening.
Since 2003, it has been Palestinian law to reward Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails with a monthly paycheck. Palestinian leadership also pays the families of Palestinian prisoners and suicide bombers. These policies incentivize terrorism.
The practice is known as pay to slay. The Taylor Force Act gets its name from the American combat veteran murdered while on a school trip in Israel. The 21-year-old terrorist behind the brutal stabbing of Force was killed by police, but he was praised by the Palestinian Authority government and his family given lifelong financial compensation. Kinds of compensation include pension for life, triple the average salary in Palestinian areas, free tuition, health insurance, and a clothing allowance for life, and a free monthly stipend. And that's where this current legislation draws the line. Congressman Ed Royce, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, says stopping that practice, courtesy of $300 million U.S. tax dollars every year, is what's behind the Taylor Force Act.
With this legislation, we are forcing the PA to choose between U.S. assistance and these morally reprehensible policies.
Despite earlier pressure from Congress to stop these payments, the Palestinian Authority has actually increased the amount paid to terrorists whom they consider martyrs. The payments are on a sliding scale. The more successful the attack, the bigger the payout. In the 2017 PA budget, money to terrorist prisoners increased by 13%, and 4% more went to their families, more than 30,000 recipients in all. This year, direct funding of terrorism has reached $355 million, and yet the PA is largely funded by U.S. taxpayer dollars.
The Palestinian Authority claims to its people that they have a right to kill Israelis, literally a right to kill Israeli civilians, a right to kill women, children, babies, and they claim that a UN decision from the 1970s, which said that the Palestinians have the right to use all means to gain their rights, means they have a right to kill civilians.
Palestinian Media Watch director Itamar Marcus said while Israel has means to crack down on terrorists, the West can play a major role.
The Palestinian Authority is so dependent on foreign aid. The United States gives them foreign aid. The European Union gives them foreign aid. Most of the Western European countries give them. They have the power to stop this.
The House Foreign Affairs Committee passage of the Taylor Force Act aims to do just that. The measures are expected to pass the full House and go on to the Senate. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And it's time that we stop this awful payment of our taxes to the Palestinian Authority to pay the salaries of Palestinian terrorists convicted of murder against Israelis. Enough is enough. Jonathan, it's excellent work you're doing. It's righteous work you're doing, and it's so important that you get as much support and encouragement as possible. But can I ask you that in October 2016, the then International Development Secretary, Priti Patel, announced that the UK was going to suspend £25 million worth of aid to the Palestinian Authority. What's happened since then?
Since then, they have restored the payments, but they've changed the system. Now, previously, they were using an account that was operated by the World Bank, and the World Bank transferred it without it being earmarked into a Palestinian Authority account, and relied on the fact that that account was being audited up until 2015 by PwC. What the British government is now doing is using a mechanism that was set up by the European Union, which is marginally more legal, let's say, although it's still very unsatisfactory. Under the European Union mechanism, the money is paid into a designated account that is only used to pay to a list of approved civil servants of the Palestinian Authority, health workers and education workers and so on. The list is vetted, again, by auditors, and we will want to be looking into whether that audit is done properly. It was previously being done by Deloitte. I don't know whether it's still being done by Deloitte or whether they've changed it to a different auditor. Very often these things are done by one of those big four practices, which include Deloitte and PwC and Ernst & Young and KPMG. It's no longer correct, as far as we can see, to say that the money is paid into the very same account out of which money is paid to be transferred to the terrorists or to their families. But the money is still being paid, and the British government is not insisting as yet that a condition of payment is that the payment to terrorists must stop, or even that the payments will be reduced to the extent that payments are being made to terrorists. The effect is that by enabling the Palestinian Authority to fund what may be generally legitimate expenditure, they are freeing up the Palestinian Authority's other resources to continue to pay the terrorists. And although the British government claims to have a memorandum of understanding that the Palestinian Authority will promote peace, they do absolutely nothing to ensure compliance with that requirement. So the British government can do a great deal more. In the meanwhile, although the British government has stopped using the World Bank account, other governments are still using it. So the way in which that account is audited, and more generally the way in which the Palestinian Authority is audited, that remains a very important subject. For that reason alone, we want to ensure that auditors have a proper understanding of their responsibilities, and that's why we're pressing this point. And we will also obviously continue to press the British government to use its undoubted power and influence and leverage as a major donor to the Palestinian Authority, to ensure that the Palestinians stops these terrible practices which lead to the murder of lots of people and completely undermine the prospects of peace and reconciliation and prevent us enjoying the peace of Jerusalem and the Holy Land.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellent report produced by Palestinian Media Watch, and this is the chairman of the Palestinian Prisoner Club actually saying that he receives money on behalf of the Palestinian Authority.
كيف تأثرت رواتب الأسرى ومخصصاتهم بظل الأزمة المالية اللي بتعصف بفلسطين؟
يعني حالنا من حال بعض، يعني في نهاية المطاف يعني الأسرى ما ينفق عليهم هو بالضبط ما ينفق علي وعليك، يعني هي رواتب، بالتالي حين تصرف الرواتب للعاملين في الوزارات وفي المؤسسات تصرف للأسرى أيضا.
There you go. We have the evidence there, thanks to the excellent work being carried out by Palestinian Media Watch. Jonathan, what role can our viewers play? Because, you know, this is not only a legal issue, but it's also a political issue. And surely our members of parliament who we elect are there to bring ministers to account regarding our taxpayers, our taxes being used to fund and support Palestinian terrorists in Israeli prisons who are being paid a salary which only glorifies and encourages more terrorism against Israelis and everyone else.
Oh, absolutely. Viewers can write to their MPs or go and visit their MPs, go to their surgeries and make sure that it's not dealt with by some underling, which unfortunately quite often happens to emails, although if enough of emails are sent, it does eventually register. You know, and I appreciate that everyone's very busy, but please, if you have a moment to spare, please go along to the surgery and express your concerns in person to the MP, and obviously if they met with someone face to face telling them that there's you're very upset by it, it's much more difficult for them to ignore it. It makes a much bigger impression on them, and they can press government ministers to really put an end to this dreadful practice.
And what's concerning, isn't it, Jonathan, and what is so deeply disturbing about this whole case is the fact that the British government here would be complicit in actually supporting terrorists and supporting those who've carried out terrorist attacks by supporting their families. And what the government should be doing is finding constructive ways to bring about a genuine peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that means not supporting projects that go to supporting and glorifying terrorism and the incitement to terrorism as well.
Yes, and instead supporting projects that will promote peace.
Absolutely.
And those include projects that will develop the Palestinian economy. And that, I think, is extremely important. You know, there was a proposal back in 1937, the Peel Commission, British Commission, set up to what should we do about the situation in what was then called Palestine. They reported, well, you need to divide it into a Jewish state and an Arab state, but that couldn't be done because the Palestinian state was not, the Arab state would not be viable because it didn't have an economy. And unfortunately, that remains the position. And before you can talk about having some kind of peace on that basis, there needs to be more of a Palestinian economy. So if the British government were to invest there and invest in reconciliation projects and projects that bring Arabs and Jews together, that would be much better than sending the money to the Palestinian Authority to waste on terrorists and fraud.
And Jonathan, do you have any plans in the near future to put pressure on the European Union while we're still in the European Union? This is something, vast sums of money go from the European Union to the Palestinian Authority. Is there any way of doing something on a wider European scale to raise awareness on this issue and put pressure on the European Commission regarding funding of the Palestinian Authority?
Well, again, I think members of the European Parliament have a role to play here, and viewers can take that up, and we take that up. It has been taken up within the European Union, but we meet some of the same obstacles that we meet here in Britain, of the politicians and the civil servants dragging their feet on this issue and pretending that everything is all right when it is not all right. When things are going on that really undermine everything else that people are trying to do.
Absolutely. And what other cases and projects are you working on that you can let us know so that we can be more informed? Okay, in 30 seconds.
We're trying to ensure that there are lots of NGOs that are associated with terrorist organisations, and we're trying to ensure that their banks and credit card facilities are withdrawn. That's one area that we've been working on very much. You can see it on our website. And also universities in Britain, we're very concerned about the difficulties that are faced by Israel societies and Jewish societies. It's very difficult for them to hold a meeting at a number of universities with any Israeli or pro-Israel speaker. And it's very important to ensure that the case for Israel and the truth about Israel gets across, because otherwise the propaganda, of which the vast amounts, will prevail.
Absolutely. Jonathan, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. Thank you for the work that you're doing in defending Israel in the whole area of lawfare, and I wish you all the best with this current case with the government. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Simon.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. We see here that the British government is indirectly responsible for helping to support terrorism, and that is why the British government has to stop paying funds to the Palestinian Authority that is being used to support glorified terrorism and pay the salaries of convicted terrorists who are murderers in Israeli prisons. Enough is enough. This has to stop. All of us got to take action and write to our political representatives to say no more. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.